Alright, so in this lesson we're going to be talking about some of the proto-socialist philosophers for the political ideas unit of government and politics. This is essentially going to be the last lesson on the socialists, and I thought it'd be useful to include because really when you're talking about socialism you really have to start with the Industrial Revolution, so you don't really have anything from the Enlightenment and earlier. So if you include these four figures and you call them proto-socialist philosophers, you can essentially talk further back in time and you can relate other stuff to it. So like you could talk about Owen Young and Owenism if you wanted to talk about Britain and I suppose his Industrial Revolution, but anyway, it just gives you more to write about for the socialism unit. So, what is a proto-socialist? A proto-socialist philosopher is a philosopher who was not a socialist themselves, and they did not use the term socialist, as it was not introduced until the early to mid-1800s, but they made significant contributions to socialist thought. Many proto-socialist philosophers are extreme rationalists, and they believe that they can learn about reality through thought instead of through observation. Hence why many tenets of socialism have no grounding in reality and are instead a product of faulty a priori assumptions about reality. For reference, an a priori assumption is an assumption made about reality that is thought to be true, but has not been proven, which exists as a predicate for a theory to be true. So, our first proto-socialist philosopher would be Plato. He introduced a kind of philosophy called Socratic communism. So, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato put forth his propositions of a socialist society in perhaps his most famous work, The Republic. In this book, Plato described how he believed the ideal society was one in which the citizens lived in communes. He obviously describes it in much more detail, but this is a brief summary. The most significant idea that he puts forth in this book is the notion that there is a world of forms which contains the perfect version of all things. The perfect version of these things would be used as a precondition for perception. For example, you know that your dog's a dog because somewhere there is a perfect dog that you use as a template for judging what is and what is not a dog. The world of forms is an idea that would be elaborated on by Immanuel Kant, and it essentially prioritized rationalism over empiricism. Neither schools of thought would be officially born until the Enlightenment, however, so you just bear that in mind. So it did this because it placed faith in an a priori assertion about reality over observations and logic. So obviously there's no evidence and there's no really way to say through observing reality that there is a world of forms, or that we base our assumptions on what an object is based on some perfect version of the object that exists somewhere. This can be considered the origin point of political idealism. Plato introduced the idea of philosopher kings in the Republic as well, and he believed that since philosophers were the wisest, and I quote, in the land, they should be put in charge of the government. This is an idea that clearly influenced Lenin's vanguard socialism, which put the communist zealots in charge of government, as communism is essentially just a strain of philosophy. Pretty much every political ideology is a strain of philosophy. It's just a dogma placed on government and how the government should run a country. So, our second proto-socialist philosopher would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's now an Enlightenment philosopher. Obviously, Plato was about 3,000 years ago, so there's a big gap between them, but it started more to essay. So the theory of history proposed by Rousseau in his discourse upon the origin of the inequality that exists among mankind, he argued that man arose from the state of nature when he first invented the idea of private property, which Rousseau laments, and man sought to protect this property by consenting to a social contract with other humans, whom also wished to accumulate property, and thus the state of law came into existence. Rousseau's theory of history is most pertinent to socialist dogma in the sense that he argues man existed freely in the state of nature with no social contract. Rousseau puts forth the image of a man in the state of nature being a noble savage, and he did not believe that the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short like Thomas Hobbes did. This established an optimistic view of human nature, which insinuated that men were naturally good and corrupted by society. Rousseau's famous quote, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," best encapsulates how Rousseau idealized the state of nature, and he believed that consenting to the social contract in the state of law was undesirable due to the freedom sacrificed. The premise that man is born good and is corrupted by society is similar to the Lockean principle of tabula rasa, so that's Latin for blank slate, which is a good comparison to make in your exam to classical liberalism, because if you're going to say, if you're going to compare it to tabula rasa, that essentially means that people are born blank slates and all of their convictions, prejudices and passions are put onto them by their experiences. So it argues that you are a product of your environment, which means the exact same thing as man is born good and is corrupted by society. Although I suppose with classical liberalism you could argue that men are born neutral, so that would be a difference between the two. So ultimately, Rousseau heavily relied upon a priori assertions about reality to produce his theories of history and the state of nature, which is in line with the French tradition of rationalism since René Descartes. And this cements Rousseau as a political idealist who had a profound influence on other proto-socialist philosophers. Obviously, just to fill you in, if you don't know, René Descartes is the famous skeptic who came up with the saying cogito ergo sum, so I think therefore I am. And I believe also SAS percepi, to be is to be perceived. It's stuff to note down, Latin quotes to add to your exam. So our third proto-socialist philosopher is Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Similar to Rousseau, Hegel made a great deal of a priori assertions about reality that he believed to be true as a result of his use of rationalism. Hegel's most important contribution to the socialist school of thought was his historical dialectic. The historical dialectic was essentially an expansion upon Rousseau's theory of history, in the sense that Rousseau used an a priori form of rationalism to make assumptions about humanity's past, whereas Hegel used a priori assumptions to determine humanity's future. For instance, Hegel believed that the capitalist state would result in the formation of a working-class consciousness which would rise from the, quote, exploitation of the proletariat under capitalism by the bourgeoisie. Once the working class developed this class consciousness, they would overthrow the capitalist state, either gradually or through revolution, and establish a socialist state. The implementation of the socialist state was dubbed the end of history, and it also involved when the socialist state is established, uh, a temporary government would be put in charge, and eventually it would wither away, leaving essentially an anarcho-communist state that ran itself. Because obviously they believe men are inherently good and cooperative, so this once again references their optimistic view of nature, so they think, whoa, if people can live together in harmony with no law enforcement, and obviously to a Hobbesian conservative, or really any type of conservative, that would not be the case. So, these are ideas that would be expanded upon by Karl Marx, and thus it is obvious to see Hegel's influence on socialist thought. And just to note, Hegel, I believe, was another Enlightenment philosopher. Same with our next proto-socialist, Immanuel Kant. Kant elaborated on the idea of Plato's world of forms with his own noumenal world. Kant believed that man's instruments of perception were flawed, so we cannot comprehend reality, and by extension we cannot determine empirical truths. Kant was also responsible for producing a system of ethics called deontological ethics, which stipulates that morality is absolute and cannot be broken. This is best exemplified in if one imagines a deranged man wielding an axe with seemingly malicious intent. Kant would argue that if that man were to ask you where a person was, and you knew where they were, you would have to tell the man where they were, although you know that this will likely result in the murder of that person. But Kant believes that you must not lie in any circumstance. Kant would say that it is a categorical imperative to tell the truth. So you must not deviate from such an imperative for any reason. Kant's contributions to socialist dogma can largely be denoted to the fact that he believed self-sacrifice to be a moral virtue as a result of his advocacy of altruism, and obviously his overdependence on a priori assertions about reality and rationalism clearly also played a part in this. It should be understood that altruism plays a major role in socialist dogma, as their optimistic view of human nature tends to perceive humans as inherently altruistic and cooperative. Therefore, Kant's philosophy adds more a priori assumptions and rather faulty premises to socialist thought about human nature. The Rawlsian modern liberals and the modern socialists evidently also utilize some of Kant's noumenal world theory to back up their postmodernism, which critiques objective categories and asserts that everything is subjective and non-binary, with no evidence to back up such assertions about reality other than these a priori assertions, which are themselves based in deep rationalism. So that's it for our proto-socialist philosophers.